What if I told you that just a few weeks ago, in a conversation that very few people imagined would happen, Mel Gibson made a statement that left countless people around the world speechless? Statements that remained hidden for 20 years were finally revealed, and what he unveiled about the energies that sought to block the passion of the Christ surpasses any hypothesis you've heard. We're dealing with a genuine spiritual struggle, where the Hollywood industry was not the only opponent Gibson needed to face. In January 2025, in an appearance on Joe Rogan's show that shocked the public, Mel Gibson broke an extensive period of silence and spoke openly about matters he had never mentioned publicly. They weren't limited to controversies or economic obstacles in making the film. Gibson unveiled that from the moment he decided to tell the story of Christ's death, a paranormal opposition began to express itself in ways he never considered viable. Did you know that even before a single sequence was filmed, inexplicable events began to occur in Gibson's private life? Absurd coincidences, terrifying encounters, and even what he characterized as direct sabotages of his psychological and physical condition. Gibson admitted there were periods during production when he wondered if he was confronting something much deeper than just the film machinery, something that rejected this particular narrative from being disclosed. Throughout those exhausting periods of filming in Italy, among the mountainous regions of Matera, Gibson began to identify behaviors that far transcended mere production complications. He described that he perceived a persistent presence, something he characterized as an energy that sought to discourage him, disturb him, and even harm him physically. And it wasn't just him. Jim Caviezel, responsible for portraying Jesus, also experienced episodes that contradict any logical interpretation. If you want to discover mysteries that few know about the hidden spiritual battles that happen when truth is announced with force, like this content, subscribe to our channel and share in the comments from which location you're watching. Because what you're about to learn can completely transform your vision of what truly happens when a person decides to tell the most significant story ever told in the trajectory of humanity. Gibson's most surprising statement came when Joe Rogan questioned without reservation about the rumors that had circulated for years in Hollywood corridors. Rumors about paranormal episodes on the filming location, about the inexplicable opposition the production faced, and about why so many people involved in the production simply didn't talk about certain experiences they had. Gibson made a prolonged pause, looked directly at the lens, and said something that not even the most faithful admirers expected to hear. He acknowledged that throughout the entire procedure of creating The Passion of the Christ, from the conceptualization to the years after the premiere, he had the progressive perception that he wasn't simply producing a film. He was entering into a legitimate spiritual war, where what was at stake was far beyond commercial profitability or artistic prestige. It was a dispute over the essence of the Christian story itself in the contemporary world. Gibson unveiled that the opposition began long before the cameras started working. When he first determined to invest his own $30 million in the venture, strange episodes began to express themselves in his private life in ways he initially sought to explain rationally. Valuable equipment on his property began to malfunction without justification. Agreements that seemed assured were suddenly cancelled. Individuals close to him began to have disturbing dreams about the venture. But it was during the pre-production stage that Gibson began to suspect that something far beyond human energies was operating in opposition to the film. He had recruited religious advisors, historians, and experts in ancient languages to ensure the veracity of the production. 3 of these advisors, at different times and without mutual knowledge, described similar experiences. All characterized a perception of spiritual suffocation when working on the most sacred elements of the narrative. Sometimes we wonder what exists beyond our physical world, and other times, strange things happen that make us question everything we thought about life. In situations like this, better understanding can mean the difference between remaining confused and having clarity. That's exactly what our ebook, The Secret of Jesus' Appearances, offers. Consider acquiring this incredible material for a symbolic value. This exclusive material offers keys to decipher divine signs and understand how Christ manifests in our days. Your contribution allows us to maintain this independent research work. The link to acquire the material is available in the pinned comment. The first advisor, a priest expert in Aramaic, described that every time he sought to work on the interpretations of Christ's statements on the cross, he perceived a physical energy seeking to block him from continuing. His hands oscillated involuntarily. He acquired intense migraines, and on one particular occasion, he lost consciousness over the documents. When he regained his senses hours later, he found that all the work from that period had been curiously erased from his device. The second advisor, a historian specialized in Roman crucifixion, had even more terrifying experiences. Throughout his investigations into the precise torture procedures used during Christ's time, he began to have vivid visualizations during the daytime period. They weren't imaginations or fantasy, but complete sensory experiences where he observed himself witnessing the real events of the Passion. These visualizations were so powerful and traumatizing that he sought medical help, but all diagnoses showed he was perfectly fine. Gibson admitted to Joe Rogan that when these reports reached him, his first reaction was doubt. But then he himself began to experience similar events. Throughout his prayer and contemplation practices about the venture, Gibson described that he perceived a malignant presence seeking to divert him from the path he had chosen. They weren't common thoughts of uncertainty or fear of failure. It was something much more explicit and personal. The determination to film entirely in ancient languages, without concessions to contemporary English, was, according to Gibson, the moment when the spiritual opposition amplified drastically. In the week following that determination, he experienced 3 apparently disconnected accidents. Initially, an inexplicable fall in his own residence that caused an ankle injury. Days later, an electrical problem in his car almost caused a serious accident. And then, during a meeting about the production, he fainted without warning, something that had never happened before in his career. It was at that moment that Gibson sought deeper spiritual guidance. He sought out priests, not only for blessing, but for direction on whether he was confronting direct demonic opposition. What they conveyed to him confirmed his worst apprehensions. Various independent religious personalities, without knowledge of each other's experiences, warned Gibson that he had chosen to tell a story that malignant spiritual energies would do anything to block. Hiring Jim Caviezel for the role of Jesus was, according to Gibson, a decision that wasn't his own. He described that during the casting process, he repeatedly had the sensation that he was being directed toward a specific actor, but didn't understand why. Caviezel wasn't the obvious choice nor the most well-known actor available for the role. But Gibson had a feeling he couldn't ignore, that this specific man had been chosen for that role by something much greater than himself. What Gibson didn't know at that time was that Caviezel himself had had prophetic dreams about playing Christ for years before receiving the call about the role. In these dreams, Caviezel saw himself on the cross, experienced the physical pain of crucifixion, and even received warnings that accepting that role would require extraordinary personal sacrifice. These dreams were so vivid and recurrent that Caviezel sought spiritual counsel, preparing himself for what he felt was coming. When Gibson and Caviezel first met to discuss the role, both experienced what can only be described as a moment of spiritual recognition. Gibson admitted that looking into Caviezel's eyes, he saw not just an actor, but someone who had been specially prepared and shaped by life itself to take on this most sacred of roles. This certainty transcended any logical analysis of the actor's talent or experience. The decision to hire Caviezel meant an immediate intensification of paranormal events. In the week after signing the contract, Caviezel's private life began to experience disturbances that transcended mere coincidences. His children began to have nightmares about the crucifixion. His marriage began to be tested in unexpected ways. And he himself began to experience intense anxiety attacks that had never affected him before in his life. Caviezel sought spiritual counsel from his priest, who immediately recognized the signs of spiritual resistance. The priest carried out special prayers over Caviezel and his family, anointing them with oil and praying specifically for protection during the production period. Caviezel told Gibson about these events, and Gibson, recognizing the similarities with his own experiences, understood he wasn't mistaken. They were at the center of a true spiritual war. The most intense period of paranormal events began during the filming of the Passion scenes themselves. The scenes depicting Christ's flagellation and crucifixion were the most physically and spiritually exhausting for everyone involved. Caviezel, who insisted on experiencing maximum realism in the portrayal, suffered real physical injuries that exceeded anything planned in the scene choreography. During the flagellation scene, despite rubber sticks being used and carefully coordinated choreography, Caviezel received several real blows that left him bruised and bleeding. Gibson described that when viewing the filmed material later, he could see moments when the choreography was clearly violated, as if an invisible force directed the blows more precisely than intended. In the crucifixion scene, the event that became famous occurred, which Gibson described as the most disturbing and important evidence of the paranormal dimension of the production. During the filming of the sequence on the cross, Caviezel was struck by a real lightning bolt. The probability of being struck by lightning is already extremely low, but what happened was much more specific and disturbing. The lightning struck exactly during the sequence when Caviezel was pronouncing Christ's words, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." The brightness and noise were so intense that they knocked the entire crew to the ground, and the cameras filmed the moment with terrifying precision. Caviezel survived without serious injuries, but described later that he felt as if he had been touched by God himself. What was even more disturbing was that this wasn't the first time lightning struck the set during the filming of The Passion. Several weeks earlier, during the filming of the Last Supper scene, lightning struck the church where they were filming, despite the sky being relatively clear and no storm being predicted. Meteorologists couldn't explain how lightning could occur under the present atmospheric conditions. Gibson interpreted these lightning strikes as signs, but wasn't sure whether they were signs of blessing or warning. He sought interpretation from various spiritual counselors, and the answers he received were mixed. Some saw the lightning as divine confirmation of the production itself. Others interpreted them as demonstrations of force by evil spiritual forces trying to intimidate or sabotage the work. What Gibson only discovered later is that the lightning strikes had biblical precedent that was deeply prophetic. In the Old Testament, lightning often represents God's presence and his judgment. When Gibson read the passage in the book of Exodus, where God reveals himself to Moses with lightning and thunder on Mount Sinai, he understood that the experiences during filming were much more deeply connected to biblical representations of divine presence than he had initially realized. The period after completing production but before the premiere was, according to Gibson, the most spiritually difficult. With the film already in editing phase but not yet released publicly, Gibson began to experience the most intense period of spiritual and physical persecution. He described feeling constantly watched, as if invisible eyes observed his every move. His dreams became terrifying, filled with visions of demonic resistance and visual representations of Christ's passion that exceeded what he had filmed. He woke every night in terrors, exhausted and spiritually unbalanced. His marriage, which was already under strain, began to crumble under the weight of what he was experiencing, although at that time he didn't connect all his personal problems with the production. It was during this time that Gibson sought a special exorcist, not because he suspected he was possessed, but because he felt the need for intense spiritual support and protection. The exorcist, who conducted several sessions with Gibson, confirmed that he was being heavily attacked by demonic forces that saw the production of the Passion as a direct threat to their influence over humanity. The exorcist carried out several liberation prayers over Gibson and his family, anointing his house and especially the spaces where he worked on editing the film. He told Gibson that what he was experiencing was nothing unusual for those who engage deeply in spiritual works that threaten darkness. He warned that the attacks might intensify even more after the premiere, but promised continued spiritual support. When The Passion of the Christ was finally released in 2004, the commercial success was immediate and exceeded the boldest expectations. The film earned over $612 million worldwide, making it the highest-grossing religious-themed film of all time. But what Gibson now understands is that this commercial success was only the external manifestation of a much deeper spiritual reality. Gibson recounted numerous testimonies he received from viewers in the months after the premiere. Testimonies of miraculous healings, conversions that happened during or after watching the film, and even cases where people who were planning suicide changed their minds after seeing the representation of Christ's Passion. These testimonies confirmed for Gibson that the film had fulfilled exactly what it was called to do. It became a spiritual tool for true transformation. But equally profound was the resistance that emerged after the premiere. Critics didn't just attack the film for its artistic choices or historical accuracy. Some attacks were deeply personal and almost irrationally intense, targeting Gibson himself in a way that seemed to exceed normal film criticism. Gibson admitted that at that time, his first reaction was to defend himself, fight the critics, and try to protect his reputation. But over time, and with the spiritual guidance he received, he understood that these attacks were part of the same spiritual war that had begun before production started. Those who attacked him, often without realizing it, were being used as tools in a much larger spiritual conflict. The most personally destructive period for Gibson came a few years after The Passion's premiere, when he made public statements while intoxicated that were interpreted as anti-Semitic. This incident, which Gibson has repeatedly apologized for and explained as a moment of deep personal collapse, almost destroyed his career and reputation. What Gibson now reveals is that during that period of life, he was in the deepest spiritual and emotional pit he had ever experienced. He was struggling with alcohol addiction, with the collapse of his marriage, and above all with the sensation that he had been abandoned by God after making the film that should have been his greatest spiritual contribution. It was a priest who told him something that completely changed his perspective. The priest warned him that the greatest spiritual attacks often come not before a spiritual work, but after it, when the one who accomplished the work is most unbalanced, most vulnerable, and therefore most useful as a negative example to others. Gibson understood that his personal falls and public scandals were part of a broader spiritual strategy to discredit not only him, but by association, the very message of the Passion of Christ. Understanding this didn't remove his responsibility for his actions, but gave him a framework to interpret his suffering as part of a larger plan. The period after the scandals was, for Gibson, a time of deep conversion and transformation. Ostracized by most of Hollywood, losing friends and professional opportunities, he was forced to confront not only his own demons, but the spiritual reality he had discovered during the making of The Passion. Gibson admitted that those years of suffering and penance were the most spiritually fruitful period of his life. Without the distraction of fame and professional success, he could immerse himself deeply in prayer, scripture study, and the search for true understanding of what God had called him to. During those years, Gibson developed plans for several projects he believed were divinely inspired. The most important of these was a sequel to The Passion, a film that would portray Christ's resurrection with the same realistic intensity and historical fidelity. But he knew he wasn't yet ready, neither spiritually nor technically, to accomplish that work. The preparation for what he now calls the resurrection of Christ took Gibson over 2 decades. It wasn't just because of the technical and financial challenges of creating the special effects needed to portray the events described in the New Testament. It was also because of the deep spiritual preparation he felt was necessary before he could touch this most sacred part of Christ's story. Gibson revealed that since beginning the script development for the resurrection, paranormal events returned with an intensity that rivaled or exceeded what he experienced during the first film. This confirms his conviction that he's engaged in an ongoing spiritual war, not a single isolated project. He described that every time he makes significant progress on the script or development, he experiences personal setbacks that seem too coincidental to be random. Equipment fails, collaborators suddenly withdraw from projects, and he himself experiences health problems that appear suddenly and disappear just as mysteriously. But Gibson emphasizes that this time he's spiritually prepared and armed in a way he wasn't during the first production. He's learned to recognize the signs of spiritual attack, respond with prayer and sacraments, and most importantly, surround himself with spiritually strong collaborators who understand the nature of what they're involved in. For the next production, Gibson revealed that he's carried out a rigorous selection process, not only verifying technical and acting talents, but also the spiritual commitment and preparation of each person who will be involved. Every team member understands that this isn't just another Hollywood film, but a spiritual enterprise that requires dedication, prayer, and willingness to face personal spiritual challenges. Caviezel has already agreed to return to the role of Christ, despite knowing it will mean even greater personal sacrifice for him. In the years since the first film, Caviezel has experienced significant professional ostracism in Hollywood, which he attributes directly to his public Christian witness and his role in The Passion. But he describes that period as a time of significant spiritual growth and deepening of faith. Gibson admitted that these experiences convinced him that The Passion of the Christ wasn't just a film, but a catalyst for a spiritual war that persists to this day. Those who aligned with the forces of good experienced paranormal protection and blessings. Those who opposed or tried to use the production for personal gain faced consequences that far transcended human punishment. The sequel he's developing, The Resurrection of Christ, according to Gibson, isn't just a cinematic continuation, but the next stage of that spiritual battle. He warned that those who get involved in the new project must be prepared to face even more extreme resistance, because the forces that tried to block the first production now know exactly what's at stake. The deepest moment of Gibson's statement came when Joe Rogan questioned directly about the lasting impact of these events on his own belief and purpose of existence. Gibson paused for almost a full minute, something rare in conversations, and when he began to speak, his voice carried a weight that transcended any performance or public persona. He unveiled that the events that surrounded the Passion of the Christ transformed him from a nominal Catholic into someone who understood viscerally the genuineness of the spiritual war that permeates our existence. Gibson admitted that before making the production, his belief was mainly cultural and traditional. He believed in God, attended the religious community, but didn't possess an experiential understanding of the paranormal power that operated both for good and evil in our world. The events during production, especially the demonstrations he personally witnessed, removed any possibility of uncertainty about the spiritual genuineness that exists beyond what our senses can perceive. He characterized a specific moment during the filming of The Resurrection, a sequence that wasn't included in the final cut of the production, when he experienced what can only be characterized as a direct, divine visitation. Gibson was alone on the set during a break, praying silently before the empty tomb scenery. When he perceived a presence, he immediately recognized as sacred. It wasn't a visualization or hallucination, but an absolute perception of Christ's presence that filled all the space around him. During those moments, Gibson unveiled that he received what he characterized as direct instructions about the true purpose of the production and his future role as a spokesman for truth in an age of growing spiritual darkness. These instructions included specific warnings about the persecutions that would come, but also promises of divine protection and empowerment to fulfill the responsibility being entrusted to him. The most surprising prophetic connection Gibson shared was related to biblical verses that began to manifest literally in his trajectory after production. He specifically cited Matthew 10:22, "You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved." Gibson explained that this verse became the central story of his trajectory after the Passion of the Christ, with each controversy and attack confirming the prophetic accuracy of Jesus' statements. He also referenced Ephesians 6:12, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Gibson affirmed that this verse became his lens for interpreting not only the paranormal events during filming, but all the systematic opposition he faced afterward. Gibson unveiled that his residence in Malibu, which was recently destroyed in the January 2025 fires, contained a private archive of documents, photographs, and evidence of the paranormal events that surrounded the making of The Passion of the Christ. This archive, which he planned to use as the basis for a future documentary, was completely destroyed in the fire. But Gibson expressed that he doesn't interpret this as a loss, but as an indicator that some truths are destined to be transmitted through individual testimony, not physical documentation. The prophetic vision Gibson shared about the future was perhaps the most impactful part of his statement. He unveiled that, throughout his prayers and contemplations in the years after production, he received specific revelations about a period of great tribulation that's approaching, when Christian truth will face unprecedented opposition. According to Gibson, the Passion of the Christ was only the first of a series of projects he was called to accomplish to prepare the faithful for that period. He characterized his next trilogy, beginning with The Resurrection of Christ, as spiritual weapons designed to strengthen believers' faith and reveal the genuineness of divine power to those who are seeking. Gibson warned that each subsequent film will face even more extreme opposition, but will also result in even more powerful demonstrations of God's presence. The moment of determining which side you're on in this spiritual battle has arrived. Our digital material, The Secret of Jesus' Appearances, reveals how Christ manifests in the last periods and what your role is in this spiritual war. Last copies accessible in the highlighted comment, "This may be your last opportunity." Gibson concluded his statement citing Romans 8:28. "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose." He explained that even the most vicious attacks against him, including the destruction of his reputation and career, were permitted by God to purify him and prepare him for the greater responsibility that was to come. He unveiled that the period of exile from Hollywood wasn't just a consequence of his controversies, but a necessary period of spiritual preparation. Throughout those years of relative ostracism, Gibson dedicated himself to intensive scripture study, particularly the prophecies related to the last periods, and to the development of film projects he believes are divinely inspired. The final message Gibson left in the conversation was a direct call to viewers to recognize that we live in prophetic times, when the line between good and evil is being clearly demarcated. He encouraged each individual to examine their own trajectory and determine which side of the spiritual battle they choose to be on, remembering that neutrality won't be an option for much longer. If these revelations awakened something in your spirit, demonstrate it by liking this content, subscribing to the channel, and sharing in the comments how God has manifested in your own trajectory. Your testimony can touch the heart of someone who needs this message. Join our community of truth seekers and continue with us on this journey of spiritual discoveries that can transform your existence forever. Gibson's statements echo those of Jesus in Matthew 7:7-8. "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. The invitation remains open to each of us, but the determination to accept this transforming truth and join the battle for the essence of humanity rests exclusively with you.